The Lord of the Rings has been a part of my life for a long time. I must have seen Fellowship on VHS or something, but some of my earliest cinematic memories are seeing the orcs rush through the breach at Helm's Deep, and the Nazgul attacking Minas Tirith. Those movies are some of my most formative media experiences. The books I had a harder time with. I think a lot of people had this experience where the movies condition them to expect an action-adventure story, only to find the books to be this solemn and meditative experience where most of the action is almost skipped over.
I think I'm getting the hang of this.
I mean, compare the Battle of Helm's Deep in the book to the version in the Two Towers movie, which takes up about 11% of the movie's runtime. I did finish the books as a kid, but I didn't reread them much, except for The Hobbit, which I've read many times. But the story of The Lord of the Rings still had a hold on me, and I do watch the extended trilogy once a year. I am one of those people. Did you know that in this scene, Viggo Mortensen broke his toe? As an adult, I've been able to appreciate Tolkien's writings more and have wanted to do a deep dive on Tolkien's lore. In doing so, I found that the published Lord of the Rings, and even the Middle-earth Bible, the Silmarillion, is only the tip of the iceberg. You see, the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit are really the only pieces of Tolkien's fantasy world that got published in his lifetime. But it was his life's work, from when he was around 25 during the First World War, all the way to his death in 1973. It existed in a constant state of flux, and Tolkien was always changing his conception of various elements of the lore, producing many different versions of characters and events. So the Tolkien fandom is in a kind of post-canon mindset. Everything from the books published in his lifetime to his unfinished drafts to his letters are considered when discussing his fantasy writings, which are collectively called the Legendarium. The versions of his stories most consistent with The Lord of the Rings, like the officially published Silmarillion, are good in their own way, but in my opinion are not necessarily better than the older tellings, which have their own charm to them. So I wanted to analyze the works of Tolkien, how they progressed thematically, and just what I think of various versions. I'm using the list of his writings provided by the Tolkien Gateway, and the 12 volumes of the History of Middle-earth to read the various versions of his tales. This series will run for quite a long time. It is not a summary, and these are not lore videos. Those kinds of videos are great. I personally do watch channels like Nerd of the Rings and Men of the West. They're great, but these are not those videos. I will only provide the summary information necessary to understand my analysis, and I'm going to focus on my own opinion and interpretation as much as possible. It's a lot of material to cover, and I don't know exactly where to start. Tolkien's writing is very dense, and it's hard to organize my thoughts. The History of Middle-earth Volume 1's first chapter discusses the Cottage of Lost Play, which is a chapter of an old book he wrote, the Book of Lost Tales, which was never published, and 3 poems, Goblin's Feet, You and I, and The Trees of Cortirion. In my first attempt to discuss this chapter, I tried to discuss all 4 texts at once, and said very little about any of them as a result. So I rewrote the script, and I'm starting small with a discussion of Tolkien's poem, Goblin Feet. Goblin Feet is not actually part of Tolkien's Legendarium, but I do think it has some thematic relevance. Now, Tolkien hated this poem, and once said, "I wish the unhappy little thing, representing all that I came so soon after to fervently dislike, could be buried forever," which is exactly why I want to discuss it. It's part of the trouble of being famous, I guess. A more obscure writer can safely leave their mistakes in the past, but seemingly everything Tolkien has ever written has been studied again and again. Even the letters he wrote have been collected in a hardcover volume to be bought and sold at Amazon.com. So, ever since Tolkien got big, his hated poem Goblin Feet has been under the public eye. So, what's so bad about it? Well, nothing really. In fact, it was quite liked by contemporary critics, and was reprinted in various poetry collections. You can check it out yourself by reading the full text over on the Tolkien Gateway, and to save time, I'll assume you've done so rather than read it in full here. Go ahead, it's a short read. It was written in part for his wife-to-be, Edith Bratt, in 1915, who liked, and I quote, "spring and flowers and trees and little elfin people." The end product of this poem is about the farthest you can get from the portentous elves of the Lord of the Rings. Tolkien drew the fantasy elements of his stories from the Norse sagas, Beowulf, the Kalevala, and so on. This poem, however, is firmly rooted in the Victorian and Edwardian concepts of fairies and similar beings, twee and diminutive, which is probably the reason Tolkien disliked it. Well, that and the general tendency for artists to cringe at their early work. I, for one, find it kind of sweet, and certainly pleasant to read, and I'm not even much a fan of poetry. From what I can tell, it is written in free verse, though there is a pattern to it. There's a 12-line stanza followed by a quatrain, and then that repeats. There's an AAB rhyme scheme in the longer stanzas. I had trouble determining a rhyme scheme in the quatrains, though. The second and fourth lines rhyme, but the first and third don't. I'm no expert in poetry, so any insights on the specifics of this poem's form would be useful, and I would appreciate comments about that. Meanwhile, I'm going to move on to discuss the poem's content. What is it talking about, and what is it saying about those things? And I apologize in advance for you having to listen to my trite attempts to analyze poetry. I haven't seriously studied any poetry since high school. First of all, if you didn't read the poem like I suggested, you might be thinking that the poem is about goblins, as in the image of goblins we get from popular fantasy. You know, green dudes with pointy ears that wield swords and raid caravans. Now, Tolkien basically invented our modern conception of goblins in The Lord of the Rings, but this idea didn't exist when Goblin Feet was written. Before that, goblin was a vague and generic term referring to a wide variety of fairy creatures. Usually the fairies we called goblins were of the more malicious variety, like a redcap or hobgoblin. In this poem, I would say the usage is even more generic, as just another word for fairy, and was likely chosen due to how it sounded, more than its specific meaning. Anyway, the poem is about the things Edith supposedly liked: spring and flowers and trees, and little elfin people. Specifically, it's about someone seeking and failing to find said elfin people, though it is possibly more optimistic about enjoying the spring, flowers, and trees. Those are abundant and present. The flittermice, which is an old term for bats, running creepily away, the blundery beetle things, the sighing grasses and hedges, the gauzy wings of golden honey flies. The little elfin people, however, are the thing the narrator is actually after, and the thing that is unattainable. They existed where the narrator stands at the start of the poem, but in the past, on the road where fairy lanterns glowed. The tiny horns of enchanted leprechauns can be heard, the padded feet of many gnomes are a-comin'. They are, for the first half of the poem, tantalizingly close, and in the second half fading out of reach. They are fading round the turn. The echo of their padding feet is dying. Oh, the sorrow when it dies. So Tolkien actually sticks some melancholy into this poem about twee little elves. I think that's part of why the poem is stuck around, actually. The hint of sadness makes the wondrous parts of the poem more compelling by contrast. Two interesting thoughts spring to mind concerning my interpretations of the poem. First, that it could be about how a person can ignore attainable sources of happiness in favor of pursuing an unattainable fantasy. We are treated to many lively and brilliant descriptions of nature during the poem, but the narrator doesn't stop to simply exist and appreciate that space. They're instead rushing forward after the fairies that they never reach. Second is the interpretation that the natural world is so brilliant along the road here due to the magical influence of the fairies, or that it is made more wondrous to the narrator by the thrill of the pursuit. I think both might be true, but in that case the poem is secretly way sadder, because when the fairies have gone totally out of reach at the end, then the magic of the natural world is gone too, leaving us with nothing but mundane reality. I lean towards the second interpretation more, simply because it's the note the poem ends on. Oh, the magic, oh, the sorrow when it dies. It doesn't go on to say that the narrator was able to find some other source of happiness now that the enchantment of the fairies is gone. We are just left with the sorrow. In either case, the fairies and the natural world are tied together throughout the poem. And just as an interesting side note, the story of the poem is kind of like the experience of reading the poem. Like the narrator, we are caught, theoretically, if you like it, in the spell of the poem, and are caught up in its wondrous descriptions. But as we pass the halfway point, we're more and more aware that the end of the poem is coming, and that the spell is coming to an end, just as the narrator is aware that the fairies are slipping away, and he's rushing to catch them. And the echo of their padding feet is dying. Oh, it's knocking at my heart. Let me go, let me start, for the little magic hours are all a-flying. So the reader too may be struck with a kind of sorrow when it dies, the poem that is, just as the narrator is when the fairies go out of reach. And the poem ends right on that note, right at the moment the fairies go out of reach. I find it interesting, and I think the poem is more than its twee surface trappings. And to close out, the poem is all about a magic time that is fading, a process that seems to have begun before the narrator began their own walk down the road. To quote, "I am off down the road where the fairy lanterns glowed." Glowed, which implies that they used to glow there before, but don't anymore. In fact, that stopped even before the narrator got on the scene. It speaks to me of a distant time where the fairies were much more present in the world, and the failed pursuit in the poem speaks to them retreating further still. Even someone who's only seen the movies can speak to the theme of the elves and magic of Middle-earth fading in Tolkien's Legendarium, to be replaced with a more mundane age of men.
They're going to the harbor beyond the White Towers. To the Grey Havens.
They're leaving Middle-earth.
Never to return. I don't know why. It makes me sad.